Warm good morning to all. I sincerely welcome all of you to this distinguished lecture series, which has been initiated by Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. This is a very, very important event in the history of Ireland in this last 3 years. This is one of the one of the biggest program which is happening, which has been sponsored by Government of India. And it is indeed our privilege that we have been able to be part of this particular initiative. But before I introduce Ambassador Seshadri, I'll take a minute to emphasize our association. And when I say our, I would just like to emphasize Professor Rao and myself. Like, Ministry of External Affairs had started this public diplomacy initiative around 2017. Wherein senior members of Indian Foreign Service, that is ambassadors and diplomats, were invited to deliver lectures to the young minds from various top educational institutions and universities across India on different issues and challenges relating to foreign policy and make them part of mainstream discussions. So in the year 2017, Ministry of External Affairs had reached out to Professor Venkatrao sir when he was the Vice Chancellor of National Law School, Bangalore, and had requested for hosting some of the lectures as part of the Distinguished Lecture Series. And sir, at that moment itself, had most spontaneously agreed to undertake that particular initiative. And I was fortunate enough to be part of that same, wherein sir asked me to coordinate. And during this association between NLSIU and MEA, there were a series of lectures which had happened, wherein Ambassador Bhashmati Mukherjee came, who spoke on the topic of India, EU, and Brexit, when Brexit was a very, very important issue then. Then Ambassador Dilip Sinha came. He spoke about this international dispute mechanism between India and the consequences between India-Pakistan disputes. Ambassador KP Fabian came discussing India's foreign policy, and Ambassador Navtesh Sharma discussed India-US, the new partnership goals in the new age. So each of those speakers had brought the contemporary political issues, international relation issues to the students, and made in simplest words explains to them what international diplomacy and the consequences which is to be there. So during COVID, this initiative had been stopped. The program was not continued. This year early, sometime in the month of February, I received a call from the MEA wherein they said that they are looking to initiate this program once more, and they wanted to know our feedback. And Professor Rao and myself, we kind of wholeheartedly expressed our interest that yes, this is one of the biggest learning platform for young students who want to enter into the field of diplomacy, legal relations, international law, and allied areas. So the moment we got the opportunity, we thought that we have to initiate it and we have to bring it to the ILR. And based on this is the initiative which we are taking, and this is the first major step between MEA and ILR. And I'll now introduce, of course, Sai Pratham has mentioned about Ambassador Seshadri. Ambassador Seshadri joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1978, and he served in several diplomatic posts during his career, which includes Nairobi, Brussels, Bangkok, Tehran, and Washington, D.C. He was also in deputation to the Ministry of Commerce from 1999 to 2003, when he was the Joint Secretary who was responsible for the WTO matters. Dr. Seshadri was the first Indian resident to Slovenia, Ljubljana from 2007 to 2010. He then went on to serve as India's ambassador to Myanmar in Yangon from 2010 to 2013. On his return to India, he was holding the position of Vice Chairman of the think tank in Research and Information System for Developing Countries, which is RIS at New Delhi, from 2014 to 2017. Thereafter, he was associated with CII in connection with a study project relating to RCEP. Dr. Seshadri had his college education in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and he secured his PhD in Applied Mathematics from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore in 1978. Dr. Seshadri has contributed a number of research articles and discussion papers on trade and other international economic issues. And also for the last 5 years, Sir is associated with the Delhi Policy Group as a Senior Fellow for Economic Security. Before I conclude, I would just like to mention that I reached out to Sir sometime in the month of April, saying that we need to, if Sir could give us a time. And Sir was immediately agreeable to it. But then he said that we should only hold this talk when students would have a free mind. And he said that I believe April is the month for examinations, and which was rightly so. So it was he who said that no, we cannot have the talk in April because I want the students to be able to engage and participate with a free mind. And so it was decided that once a new semester starts, we have the new batch of students, the new semester starts, the students would be fresh mind and then we will have this. So when I reached out in the month of July, he readily agreed to have this talk in this September. Sir, a warm welcome to you, sir. And I request Pratham to continue with this. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for that illuminating introduction of such a luminary. Over to, okay. May I now invite Vice Chancellor Professor Dr. Venkat Rao sir to felicitate our esteemed guest Ambassador Dr. V.S. Seshadri, I.F.S. retired, and welcome him to Allah. A moment that beautifully symbolizes our gratitude and respect to him. Thank you, sir. May I now request Vice Chancellor Professor Dr. Venkat Rao sir to address the gathering.
I would say His Excellency Ambassador Seshadri, distinguished colleagues and fellow students. It's a dream come true for me today because it has been my long cherished desire to listen to the erudition of Ambassador Seshadri, who is known for his intellectual prowess, then value-neutral judgment, and absolute commitment to the steadfast values. And thanks to the initiative taken by Professor Yashomathi Ghosh and Ministry of External Affairs, the dream has come true today. Today is doubly auspicious because it is the 4th day of Navaratri, where Katyayani Mata is worshipped. And today is also the birthday of an extraordinary Indian who was born on this day in 1916, and after whom this day has been named as Antyodaya Divas. I am referring to Deen Dayal Upadhyay. The Government of India has declared 3 years ago that this day be celebrated as Antyodaya Divas. And in our own humble way, we are celebrating that. I have also come here to listen to Seshadri. Therefore, I don't want to stand between you and him, but just by way of curtain raiser, I would like to offer certain opening and welcome remarks. My mind goes back to 1993, when Alvin Toffler and his wife Heidi Toffler published a book called War and Anti-War. It was in 1993, and whatever he has predicted has come true in 2025. That's what you mean by research in social sciences. In one sentence he said, the future wars will be fought not in battlefields but in marketplaces. And that is where you need to focus. And he said, in 21st century, economic and ethnic rivalries, political demagoguery, religious fanaticism, the erosion of multilateralism and rise of nation states sovereignty and various allied causes are likely to produce conflicts in the coming years. How true it has become today. Now, if Alvin Toffler has said that, there is another group of scholars who say international trade has made interdependence inevitable, and therefore international trade will prevent Third World War. There will not be any Third World War, there will be only minor skirmishes. So where does the truth lie between these two views? We look forward to listen to Seshadri's wisdom. Today we live at such a cross juncture that at the dawn of globalization, people said geography has become a part of history and the whole world has become a small village. But the upsurge in inward tendencies, protectionist measures, and nationalist movements has made the world as diverse as possible, and the distances are looking long. So, where are we going ahead? Washington consensus on the one hand, Beijing consensus on the other. Are we getting sandwiched between these two? Especially when President Donald Trump has launched a revolution in American foreign policy, repudiating United States global leadership and adopting a nakedly nationalist transactional foreign policy. Mark the use of the words nationalist transactional foreign policy. He has removed United States from critical intergovernmental bodies. He has shaken long-standing United States alliances, upended the global trading system to such an extent that the existence of WTO itself is being questioned. He has abandoned the traditional concerns for human rights and slashed nearly all funding to the United Nations. This decisive shift in the global role of United States is unfamiliar and unsettling. For the first time in 8 decades, the UN is today 80 years young. The world does not have a hegemon committed to leading, underwriting, and defending an open, liberal, rules-based international system. So where are we going ahead? What are the geopolitical considerations and ramifications of international trade? Are there challenges or are there opportunities for us to move from what Shashi Tharoor calls a world disorder to a new world order? We look forward to Ambassador Seshadri's erudition and wisdom on this crucial area. Over to you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Honorable Vice Chancellor Venkat Rao, Professor Yashomati Ghosh, distinguished faculty of IIULER, and dear students. First of all, I have to offer my profuse thanks to the Vice Chancellor, Professor Venkat Rao, for inviting me to your great university and for delivering this lecture. And also, I must add, for the excellent introduction that he gave just a few minutes ago for this lecture, setting out the international landscape in which we are presently situated to be addressing this topic. Okay. Our subject, international trade law, challenges and outlook, is certainly of great importance, but also somewhat complex, and made even more complex by what we see are the everyday developments these days, starting right from the beginning of this year. My highlight during this lecture will be to bring to you how it matters for India and what should we be doing and what is important for you as students of law. This would be the focus of my lecture. And the main coverage during the next 40 to 45 minutes, what I'll try to do is to set out in some details how the three trade majors of this world, and here I'm talking about the United States, the European Union as a bloc of 27 countries, and China, which together command today about a little over 40% of world exports or imports, and therefore they have a substantial influence on international trade and the way it is run, and how these countries today are following very different paths in their own interests, and in a manner of speaking, therefore, they are undermining the world trading system. We will then examine how it is going to impact on India, how we are responding to the challenges, and what could be possible ways ahead. And of course, then see what are the possible outlook scenarios that we may see in the coming years and ways ahead. But before all that, it's very, very important, because I am not sure how familiar each one of you is with the basic principles of international trade. So what I will try to do in the first few slides after this is to sketch out what are the basic principles governing international trade before we actually go into what is really happening. And here, if I can look at the origins of the current world trading system, dates back to the immediate post-World War era. That is, I'm talking about 1945 after, which emerged with the setting up of the Bretton Woods institutions, and we call by Bretton Woods IMF and World Bank. But along with that also came up, there was an international trade organization that was envisaged, but it never saw the light of day. But instead, there was an ad hoc arrangement called General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, which came about and came into operation on 1st January 1948. And obviously, the victors of the war, mainly the United States and the Western Europe, they were the leaders in devising this system and the principles. And these are largely followed even to this day. But what we must understand is that how were they guided into making these principles? That is because of the pre-war experience that they had during the 1930s of currency wars, tariff wars that took place between 1930 and 1945. And that led them to this experience of what should be the future. We should never forget this, because that is the part which led to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And in many people believe that the cause of the World War itself was due to the Great Depression that took place during the previous years. So this history needs to be borne in mind today when people are riding roughshod over these trade principles. But we will now go on to look at what are the key principles underlying trade. One of the key principles is non-discrimination. That is, an importing country A imports from B, C, D. It will apply the same duty and charges and regulations for each one of the imports, for the identical product. So whether it is from B or C or D, the country A will apply the same duty, non-discrimination. It is also called most favored nation principle, because every nation is most favored. So this is the first basic principle of present day GATT, non-discrimination. The second basic principle is national treatment. After the good has come into the country, after crossing the border and payment of duties, the treatment that country will give to that good will be similar to the like national good that will be in the country. You will not apply one GST for the imported product and another GST for the like domestic product. It has to be the same. So this is called national treatment. The third fundamental aspect is every country would have a schedule of tariff commitments. It's called bound tariffs. And during subsequent rounds of GATT negotiations or WTO negotiations, these tariffs will be brought down progressively. And no country can exceed the bound rate of tariff that is in its schedule in terms of application of customs duties. So these are three basic principles on which GATT was founded. There are a lot of rules about dumping, customs valuation, subsidization, etc., which are also there in the GATT. I will not go into them. But what I want to stress is that these conditions gave stability and predictability to international trade. So an importer or an exporter knew what to expect when his product reaches from one shore to another, what tariff will be charged, what regulation it will be charged, and so on. This is very, very crucial for international trade to thrive. And economically, if you look at it, what did it mean? That normally trade will take place on the basis of whichever is most competitive. So it allowed comparative advantage to countries which could produce a product efficiently and competitively. And this theory of comparative advantage was based on which this whole international trade was taking place, and we saw globalization flourishing during the 80s, 90s and thereafter. These are very, very important aspects to be borne in mind. Two other aspects also need to be borne in mind. One is there is a practice which was followed in GATT, that is, developing countries and least developed countries will receive full than not full reciprocity. So if developed countries reduce their tariff by X%, developing countries were not expected to reduce by the same X, but maybe slightly less. So it's called less than full reciprocity treatment in the GATT. Today it is important I mention it because just today you would see in the news that China has relinquished its right to follow less than full reciprocity. That's very, very important. But this is another aspect that was followed in the GATT. And lastly, you will see that free trade agreements, there is an exception to the non-discrimination principle. Non-discrimination says I will charge the same duty. But if I enter into an agreement with another country for an FTA, free trade agreement, then I could reduce my duties with that country to 0. I don't have to be non-discriminatory there. But there are some conditions. You cannot just reduce tariff on 2 or 3 items. You will have to have the coverage has to be substantially altered. And there are a number of examples of free trade agreements. The European Union, for example, is a free trade agreement of 27 countries. It is also a customs union, which is a further higher grade than free trade agreement, where the customs duty charged by all the countries in the union is the same. So that's a customs union, but let's not go into those details. I would only stop at saying free trade agreement is an exception to the non-discrimination principle, and today there are around 400 FTAs signed between various countries. That is also important to remember. The prime example I told you, free trade agreement, is the European Union. Another important example that we will come later on in this lecture is also called CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Initially it started as TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. The negotiations are led by the United States and included, as the name itself mentioned, Trans-Pacific countries, that is both Asia countries and Pacific countries. But Trump, under his first administration, one of the first acts he did was to get out of TPP. And the 11 members which were left out, they together continued to be part of TPP, and they renamed it as CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. UK has recently become a member. So these are important things to remember when we talk further. We go to the next. Now, fast forward to 1995, when the World Trade Organization, WTO, was shot. Then WTO was established. Now the trade rules expanded. The portfolio of agreements that WTO covered included trade in services and also minimum standards for intellectual property rights, IPR. And it also covered more substantively textiles, agriculture, etc., which were not so fully covered during the GATT regime. Importantly, and this is particularly important for you following trade law, during the GATT days, that is till 1995, there was an informal procedure of settling trade disputes. That was in the form of consultations, but never formally done in that manner. And because countries which were party to the dispute could disagree on the findings of the consultations, it never was enforceable. But under the WTO, they entered into a two-tiered dispute settlement mechanism. One is at the panel stage, another is at the appellate body stage. And they all went into the dispute, looked at the issues, and the findings of this panel or the appellate body were put to the WTO general body. Who was at fault? What is the damage? How much repair measures have to be done, etc. And the WTO body had to adopt the report by, and this is crucial, negative consensus. What is negative consensus? WTO normally operates by consensus, positive consensus, which means everybody, all the members of the WTO have to agree. But what is negative consensus? When you put before the body, it is taken, the appellate body report is taken as adopted unless there is a consensus against it. So, in a sense, the panel and the appellate body had a lot of force in them in terms of pushing their conclusions. And in the history of the WTO, no panel or appellate body were taken off. This is important to understand. So that is why the dispute settlement system of the WTO is called the crown and the jewel of WTO. And most important also is to realize that this system of regulating trade was so popular that GATT membership in 1945, founding members were 23. When WTO was established, membership grew to 76. But today, the number of WTO members are 166. And 22 more countries are standing in the queue. So you can understand the amount of value that a membership of the WTO attaches to following the trade system as established by the WTO. It also has China, which acceded to WTO in 2001, Russia, which acceded to WTO in 2007, and Vietnam, which acceded in 2012. Why do I mention these members? Because these are communist countries which had earlier, when the Bretton Woods system was formed, had not become members of them because they said we will not associate ourselves with these capitalist institutions. But subsequently they found the merit of being part of this predictable and stable system. So they became part of this. Of course, the West in turn admitted these countries in the hope that over a period of time they will also become market economies, because they will not be centrally planned economies, but they will become market-oriented economies. Now, unfortunately, the development during the last 2 decades have belied those expectations. On the one hand, there are today geopolitical differences between the West and the Russian Federation. The Ukraine conflict and all that preceded it is, you can say, one manifestation of it. On the other side is the vastly growing economic profile of China. There is also the Taiwan factor casting a shadow over all these proceedings. And China, with its economic clout, is no longer hesitant to project larger ambitions, including the development of a more China-centric order. And relative economic terms, the West is weakening. And further highlighted by the fact there is also now some disunity within the Western countries. So, but I am not going to analyze in my lecture the East-West divide, etc. further, but on how it is impacting on the global trade policy and the tensions we see. And as I said earlier, the European Union, the United States and China today contribute to about 40+% of imports and exports. And they are acting very differently on these issues. Of course, trade always had a certain amount of political pressure to it in the form of export controls, in the form of sanctions, technology denials, etc. These have been there. But what we see today is a scale far higher. And be it in the form of abuse of tariffs that we have seen during the Trump administration now, or in terms of creating excess capacity in specific areas and weaponizing that excess capacity as China is trying to do, or playing intimidation or economic coercion as we are seeing on purchase of Russian oil, etc. that we are facing. And in the process, WTO compliance is steadily getting diminished. The approaches of these major powers towards forging new free trade agreements also are different. Now, this is sending very, very confusing and conflicting messages to the rest of the world who are wondering what's to be done. So, this is what I will now focus on, and I will start with looking at what is happening vis-a-vis the US. Now, we are talking about a country which is the world's largest market, which is also the world's largest importer, and therefore it has enormous leverage as a result of that. Now, even under the Trump 1 administration, I'm talking about the years 2017 to 2020, the Trump administration was uneasy about WTO rules. It was getting concerned about what it felt were very unfair trade practices by China, against whom it launched investigations under its 301 investigation on the guise for the reason that they were violating intellectual property rights violations. And penal tariffs were imposed, China imposed counter tariffs and so on. But under Trump 1, we also saw US using national security as a ground for imposing tariffs and restrictions on steel and aluminum. Now, the argument that the US gave was steel is very strategic item for my economy, aluminum is very strategic for my defense and other uses, and my production or manufacturing in these items is diminishing. And the bound tariffs that US had did not allow it to increase exports. It said, I am facing national security issue, so I am going to increase tariffs. So violating the WTO rules, it imposed tariffs on steel, aluminum, etc. in order to enable the domestic industry to go. Additionally, because US was feeling uneasy about the dispute settlement mechanism coming in the way of implementing its policy. So even starting from Obama onward, but under Trump, he refused to approve the appellate body nominations of a few candidates which came by during that time. And as a result of which, the appellate body could not continue anymore after December 2019. So as of today, the WTO dispute settlement system, while the panel system is still available, But if somebody appeals the panel report to the appellate body, it is in the white. So in a sense you can say it is dysfunction. Now, then came President Biden. This was 2020 to 2024. Now, interestingly, although it was a Democratic Party government, they continue many of the Trump for one measures. But one key difference between Trump 1 and Biden was that he said, I must work with my allies and friends. So he started a policy of looking at China as the main issue, because during COVID, it was felt that trade dependence on even simple things like masks, etc., suddenly made those commodities rare. So there was a feeling in the trading world, particularly in the Western countries, which also experienced shortages of chips and other items, semiconductor chips, etc., that we should become more self-reliant, at least within the Western world. There should be more resilience of supply chains, etc. So Biden worked on that front of increasing economic security and resilience, getting together friends, and he came up with ideas like Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, etc., of which India was also a member. But he also violated some rules of the WTO, like putting 100% tariffs on electric vehicle imports from China into the US on economic security. So you can see Trump 1 beginning in a certain way, Biden following, increasing a few violations, but working largely with allies and friends. But then comes Trump 2 from the beginning of this year. Now, Mr. Trump is no longer even pretending to be adhering to WTO rules. He has declared a national economic emergency under the country's International Economic Emergency Powers Act, IEEPA, and arming himself with the powers to reset tariffs. He has introduced what he has called reciprocal tariffs to reset the balance that he feels has been very adversely inflicted upon the US on trade with various countries. So he has been pushing countries to arrive at deals with the US to get their reciprocal tariffs down. While negotiating deals with various countries, he is in turn asking them to contribute to America, which even today is the richest country in the world, to contribute to America's manufacturing, to enhance investments in the US, and de-risk dependence on certain strategic items like steel, aluminium, critical minerals, semiconductor chips, etc. So here is the richest country asking other countries to pull in to make America more self-reliant on many of these items. So he is leveraging the access to its market by trying to impose these conditions, and other countries are left with no choice but possibly to comply. So tariff as a tool is becoming the leveraging tool, disregarding all WTO rules that we talked about earlier. And he is clearly has a preference for a regime of not comparative advantage that we talked about earlier, but a regime of balanced trade and managed trade, with Mr. Trump holding the stick, not the WTO dispute settlement system. So see the difference. So in all the bilateral deals that have been concluded so far, what are the elements that are key there? First, the concessions, contributions have the partners have made are something like this. One is reduction in tariff and non-tariff barriers by all the countries. They are calling it a tariff Trump round, but US will not reduce its tariffs. That is still high. The other countries have to reduce their tariffs to virtually zero, which they have done. Second, accept products including in respect of vehicles as per US standards. And this they have done. For example, European Union has struck a deal in which it has said US can export to vehicles to EU as per US standards. Japan has said the same. Korea has said the same. So he has been able to push them to accept this. C, commitments to make substantial purchases of US energy equipment, defense equipment, farm produce, etc. This again, these countries have done. Like for example, European Union has agreed to purchase for the next 4 years $750 billion worth of goods from the US for the next 4 years, and also make investments into the US. So again, EU has agreed to make $600 billion of investment during the next 4 years into US. And likewise, Japan has agreed to make $550 billion. Korea has agreed to make $350 billion. And one other thing, that is our neighbor Pakistan. They have reached a different kind of a deal. He has forced countries, and in this case Pakistan has allowed US companies to access their natural resource or other forms of exploitation, including in the cyber and other areas. So these are the types of deals that he is looking for and what he has achieved so far. Now in return, what is US willing to do? Nothing much, if I can say so. It says it has already raised the tariff 10% for countries with which US has a surplus, like UK for example. Now why should UK, which has a deficit with US, or US has a surplus with UK, agree to reduce and have its tariffs at 10% for entry into US? You give me any argument. No argument, economic argument can justify this. But he has been able to extract this simply because UK wants access to the US market. And then he says if you have a trade surplus with US, just like we have or the European Union has, the minimum is 15%. It could be 15 to 20% if you reach a deal with US. And if you are not able to reach, then it will be even higher. Just like in our case, we have not been able to reach a deal with US, so we have been assigned a tariff of 25%. And it must be added, these reciprocal tariffs are in addition to the MFN tariffs. MFN tariffs are already, as I told you, as agreed during the various GATT rounds, for which the average for US is 3.4%. So if you have to export to US today, you don't have a non-discriminatory access, you have a very graduated access depending on what Mr. Trump has laid down, and this is entirely different from what the GATT gave you as a guarantee. And in respect of India, he has also put an additional 25% imposed from August 27th onwards for buying Russian oil. So you can see There are trade issues of balance, which is using as an argument. He is using arguments in terms of Russian oil. He is using in terms for Mexico, Canada, for fentanyl drug trafficking and for immigration. He has put another set of tariffs. So all kinds of issues are being sought to be solved through the leverage of tariff, which he called a beautiful word. Next. Now, so very clearly, you don't need a panel or an appellate body to come to a finding that US is violating WTO rules. It is violating the non-discrimination principle as in Article 1 of GATT, I told you. It's violation of Article 2. It has gone much above the bound rates of 3.4%. It is imposing high tariffs on steel, aluminium, and he has included more items on the national security grounds during these few months. They include on automotives and auto parts, copper, lumber, and he has also started investigations on semiconductor chips and pharmaceuticals. So they are also waiting in the queue. You might see additional tariffs being imposed on them. These are not reciprocal tariffs. These are separate national security tariffs. And so they basically undermine stability and predictability. You don't know what you are in for, because tomorrow you might come up with a new set of tariffs, and this upsets businesses. You cannot plan for anything for the future. How will it impact? It is something remaining to be seen. So we will have to wait and see how these play out. But worst part is, by coming to this deal, the partners who sign these deals are also becoming complicit in WTO illegality, because they in turn will have to be giving so, as I said, the partners are also being made to be complicit in this illegality, because they in turn have to be giving special tariff treatment to the United States. Now, where is this all leading to? What is the end game? This is not very clear, except that there were landing zone, as it were, of what's happening. Some idea has been given in this regard by a former USTR, Lighthizer, who was Trump 1 administration's US trade representative. As you know, US trade representative is a cabinet level appointment in the US, looking after all trade negotiations. What he has advocated, and this is an extract from his opinion piece in the New York Times. It was written sometimes in April when the reciprocal duties were being imposed. He called for a two-tier system of tariffs. One tier for countries that have more or less trade balance, which are more democratically elected, etc. In other words, saying these are my friends, my group of friends, with whom we will have more or less a trade balanced trade relationship, and with the others that include communist countries or people with whom we don't come to a deal, for them it will be higher tariffs. And over a period of time, if those within this group suddenly there becomes more imbalance, then they will be kicked out of the group and then they will be facing higher tariffs. So in the manner in which it has been mentioned, it is not stable, it is not predictable, it is based on more or less might is right kind of principle. And this was subsequently also more or less vindicated by the present USTR, Jamison Greer, who has written an article in the beginning of August, that is last month. He wrote a piece in which he has again more or less talked about similarly, and he pointed to the deal reached between the US and the European Union on 27th of July as the model agreement on which future trade could be built. So instead of Bretton Woods system, what he called was, the last slide, Turnberry system, because Turnberry golf course is where the agreement between European Union and the US was signed. And basically it's saying if the deal is more balanced, it is more sustainable. That's the argument. So here we are going from an economic principle of comparative advantage, economic efficiency and all the rest, to one of balanced trade, rebalancing and all those issues. And of course, with the dispute settlement system now being handed over to the US administration, who will be the stick. So where this is leading us to remains to be seen. So there are two unknowns. Whether this whole system is sustainable. One is whether they will continue to be in state will be decided by two factors. One is inflation. What about US GDP? Will it continue to grow under these circumstances? Or will there be a downturn? And Mr. Trump, being a businessman, is very sensitive to also stock market, how it does. So we will have to wait and see how the US economy reacts to these measures and whether all the investment that have been promised will come in, will make US even more prosperous, or it will be the other way around. That is the first unknown that could decide whether this will continue to stay. The second unknown is more legal. There is a case now in the Supreme Court of the US. This is after the case has already been decided in the lower courts of the US, that Mr. Trump doesn't have the legal authority to impose such tariffs. Now this is going to be tested in the Supreme Court, the hearings of which will become available from November. And they have fast-tracked it. We will have to wait and see how this case will be heard. So what is at issue? Whether the trafficking tariffs is meant by for fentanyl trafficking, for immigration, etc. That has also been questioned, or whether the reciprocal tariffs, that is what I mentioned earlier, these are both under question. And the question is, the legal question is, does International Economic Emergency Powers Act, under which President Trump has invoked these tariffs, does it allow the US President to impose tariffs as a tool for emergency economic action? Now, the national security tariffs, the base tariffs on aluminium, steel, etc., they are not at issue. It must also be remembered. Now, both the Court of International Trade, the lower court, and the US Court of Appeals have clearly ruled that Mr. Trump doesn't have the power. The power rests with the US Congress to reset taxes and tariffs, not Mr. Trump, and this question will arise. So, of course, the second court, did it by a 7-4 majority. And in US, court system is somewhat different because the Supreme Court judges are appointed by the various administrations. And the present Supreme Court is composed of 9 judges. 6 judges nominated during the Republican administrations and 3 judges by Democratic administrations. Of course, they will have to rule on the basis of law, not on political affiliation. But still, law can be tweaked here and there. We will have to wait and see what happens. But the important point to remember is that they will not decide whether it is WTO legal or not. No. They will decide on the basis of domestic law and whether the president has the power to go above the heads of the Congress, to invoke emergency economic powers and take the kind of actions that he has taken. Does he have the power? We will have to wait and see. But as students of law, I think it will be very, very interesting for you to see how the case is argued before the court, how the various responses are, because the parties which have appealed to the courts, one is of course on the one side the administration which is appealed, but the parties which lodged the case in the court are all small businesses and 9 democratic states of the US. So you can see a politically charged battle taking place in November, and the world will be waiting to see what happens there. Now let's be turned now to the China challenge. Now China has emerged as a trade major and now flaunts its economic system as socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics, or whatever you make out of it. This is unlike the US and EU with open market economy traditions, and this has led to many, many friction points. China preaches very lofty principles, talks about how it is an upholder of multilateral trade rules and so on, but in actual practice simply does what it wants and resorts to coercion where necessary, and helped in turn by the opaqueness of its system. So, already accounting for 35% of world manufacturing output, its strategy, so evidence from the recent developments, is to create overcapacities in specific areas, particularly strategic areas, push them as cheap exports, corner a good global share of that item, and then keep it ready for weaponizing whenever it is necessary for use of political purposes or otherwise. There is a substantial role given in the process for state-owned enterprises. The wheeled hand of government is there everywhere. It has a very strong subsidization policy, industrial policy, with targeted subsidization. And also there is this champion building that takes place, China government and the private sector working very closely. The high level of subsidies that China gives have also been commented upon by the WTO itself. Normally, an organization, international organization like WTO is very circumspect about making comments on domestic policies, but yet you will see in this, this is what the WTO Secretariat report had to say about China's subsidies. You could say that the notifications given by China do not provide information on expenditure level in sectors where government is likely to have global repercussions. Government support is like aluminium, electric vehicles, solar modules, glass, shipbuilding. These are precisely the sectors where weaponizations are taking place. And of course, it says information available from commercial databases, not from government, indicates large amounts of public support for companies in key economic sectors. So you can see very clearly the ruling by the WTO Secretariat saying very clearly a large amount of subsidization is taking place in China. And of course, China is also creating a China-centric order, economic order, clearly with initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Global Development Initiative. Now they have come up with a new initiative, Global Governance Initiative. And of course asking various countries to become part of it, etc., which countries do because they don't want to displease China. Expanding use of yuan, currency swapping facilities. It is also applied to become a member of CPTPP, about which I talked about earlier, but they have not been approved yet. So, and during the Biden administration, when it saw de-risking moves by various countries, it has started approaching following a twin track approach. On the one hand, it is identifying those countries with which it knows whenever they see countries putting restrictions on Chinese goods or de-risking, they are retaliating. And you can give the example, for example, it has put restrictions on export of critical minerals, magnets, and so on, and using that as a lever to get reciprocal concessions. EU imposed some duties on electric vehicles coming into EU from China based on subsidies. So immediately it imposed certain restrictions on export of brandy from France, cheese from France, etc. So it's able to identify targets and match them. So that is one set of approaches. The other is, it is also charming offensive, again with countries like ASEAN countries, with Australia, with some countries in Europe which are more friendly towards China, and dividing in the bargain the European Union in the process. Countries like Hungary, Slovakia, etc. are a little more friendly towards China. So you can see the approach being followed by China in respect of India itself. They have restricted export of iPhone manufacturing machinery to India. Technicians coming from China to service some of those companies. Tunnel boring machines, they have put restrictions on exports to India, etc. So they are following this twin track approach for their own ends. In brief, therefore, while international trade was built as one where interdependence will create greater trust, reliability, what China is doing is one-sided dependence, where it can use that others' dependence on it for possible weaponization, achievement of political or other objectives. So again, you can see one other major player in the international trade following a different track and pursuing its own objectives. Now, what about the European Union? While again, EU, again and again says it prefers to work with multilateralism, with WTO rules, etc. But in recent years, it has found refuge in climate policies and using climate policies as an excuse to protect its own industry. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will come into force from next year, is one where it is going to impose a lot of restrictions on imports coming into Europe steel, aluminium, fertilizers to begin with. It could include more items. And this legally, it is not as per the Paris Agreement, climate agreement, because it is not as per the common but differentiated responsibilities. Is a fundamental tenet of the Paris Agreement. This doesn't conform to that. So here is a third player, the European Union, using regulation as a way of dealing with trade. So you had US, you had China dealing with it differently. But it is using in a different manner regulation as a front line. And of course it is going strong now on use of industrial policies like the competitiveness compass based on the Draghi report, Critical Minerals Act, I think the name of that act is Net Zero Industries Act. It has imposed Critical Minerals Act, etc. All giving substantial amount of subsidies to targeted industries in the EU, which of course will be, whether they are WTO compatible is a big question mark. But since WTO despot system is not really functional now, so you can see EU again taking a little freedom to formulate its own policies. And in fact, now the EU Trade Commissioner is called not only Trade Commissioner, but Commissioner for Trade and Economic Security. So economic security has become a very key element also in EU's approach towards trade and other economic issues. Of course, that said, as I mentioned earlier, EU is not such a united house in terms of policies. There are countries which differ, like Slovakia, Hungary, which have different approaches towards EU. Likewise, how to deal with the United States, again, is an issue that there are different sentiments within the EU membership. So these are issues that EU is facing with. But what it is doing is also it is already party to the largest number of free trade agreements. Unlike US, which has only limited number of FTAs, I think it is less than 20. China is party to about 22 FTAs, whereas European Union is party to over 45 FTAs. EU itself is an FTA, but EU as one is concluded FTAs with over 45 other partners. And as you know, we are also trying to conclude a deal with the EU. Now, of course, EU is very deeply upset with the Trump tariffs and the actions taken by the Trump presidency. Initially, in fact, the Trump imposed a 20% reciprocal tariff, which increased to 30%. But after that Turnberry deal, they brought it down to 15%. But EU had to make very substantial commitments. I mentioned those numbers in terms of investments, purchases, etc. So, now that I have dealt with the trade policies of each of these three trade majors, I have not dealt with others like Japan or Korea for the simple reason that on trade matters, they are more rule takers than rule makers because their share in international trade is not so high. Moreover, in these difficult times, even groupings like ASEAN are hedging their bets. They don't know which way to go, so they are, engaging with EU, engaging with US, engaging with China, and keeping their options open because they need to protect themselves. But at the same time, they're also employing certain industrial policy measures to improve their industries, etc. Most of them also have come to a deal with the US. Now, what is India's response? We come to that. savings and export the rest. Wage suppression. Now, this is beyond trade issue. This is a more economic issue, but related to trade, because the effects of these economic policies fall upon trade. How do you discipline them? How do you build the relationship between these kind of issues and trade issues? That is another challenge that many have raised, and how do you bring that under the umbrella? That is another challenge that WTO or whatever is made out of it in future deals with. Our own Commerce Minister, he attended a WTO ministerial meeting in June or July this year, July, at the OECD meeting, and he talked about how it was important for the WTO to curb non-tariff barriers, address distortions created by non-market economies. So we have used the term non-market economies and restoration of a strong dispute settlement mechanism. He also pitched for retention of the consensus-based system, because some of the countries are putting the blame on the consensus-based system as the main culprit, standing in the way of pushing through more reforms, etc. But our viewpoint is that we should keep the consensus-based system and continuing the practice of special and differential treatment for developing countries. This again is one of our key demands. So, all these issues arise, but where do we stand? Will the present circumstances prevailing in the trading world, any of these is feasible? This is the point we need to check, because that requires consensus between the players. And what is currently happening really is tariff warfare, and we don't really have the situation where consensus can emerge. The three trade mergers are pushing in very, very different directions. So, in the coming months, I personally do not see any resolution happening very quickly, and it will be very, very surprising to see if during the next 6 months or so, we move in some positive direction before the next WTO ministerial meeting in Cameroon, which is take place in March 2026. Now, will some miracle happen that will make things a little more positive looking by that time? We will have to wait and see. But my own submission is that let that go on its own pace. I think we need to, as India, continue to try and see if we can, number one, come to some kind of a bilateral trade agreement with the United States, because that trade relationship is very, very important, and notwithstanding who is in the White House. And equally, if we can get free trade agreements moving with the other important trade major, that is the European Union, that will be a very, very significant development. I think that will give us a little more stable room to plan our moves and see how we can go forward. I think that is where I will conclude. Thank you very much for your kind attention. It's been a very long session. I know it's an area which many of you may be not so familiar with. So pardon me if I have exceeded my brief sometimes, but thank you very much.